Yeah, so great. And by the way, I'm recording the call, just so you're aware. Uh, yeah, I mean, I think it's great that we're all able to kind of come together. And I think at this point, it's like we all want to work together. Now it's trying to figure out like the exact way and form and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's kind of a little bit of a complicated situation. The fact that Paul and I want to do something. You guys have an existing company, and you have a lot of people, and you've already built a ton of value. And so, at least from my perspective, like I feel that one, it'd be great to make a game together, but ideally, the ideal scenario for me is like we can kind of combine into the same company.
Hmm.
But I also want to make sure that Paul and I are adding enough value so that it's valuable for you guys to combine with us. And so, from the way that I'm thinking about it is one, I want to make sure that if we do combine, that there's enough value. So I think it's for me, I'm kind of thinking we make it contingent upon us being able to raise additional funds or getting a publisher deal, or ideally both, so that there is enough value and we're going after like higher opportunity sorts of projects together. And assuming that that's the case, and if there's high level agreement on that, then just kind of determining what the fundraising strategy and what the organizational strategy would look like. And so like, determining how much to raise, how we would do equity and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of like next steps. But in terms of that high level, Shang and Paul C, like what do you guys, whether there's like at least high level agreement on that concept?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, it sounds very exciting to me. I think we
Right.
do have some logistical challenges, as you mentioned. That I think the deal structure is potentially very complex.
Yep.
Or maybe complex isn't the right word, as much as we need to find a creative way to make this work.
Yeah.
If we're going to go out and raise new money, very few investors are going to want to spend some of that money acquiring an existing company. Um, at least to get a team. I mean, potentially if there were a revenue stream and IPs or something like that associated with it, that may be a little different. But typically, new investors want to invest in the new opportunity, not in an existing company. So I think that could potentially be a problem. I don't think that's necessarily should be an issue in the
Yep.
ideal world, because I think this kind of a structure could bring a lot of value. An existing team, um, one of the things you said in your video with Sean that really struck me was that how much more successful teams are that have worked together for a while.
Exactly.
I
Right.
totally believe that. It takes time for a team to gel, to really become able to make a high quality creative product.
Right.
And I think that's a value we really would bring. Unfortunately, I think that's a little underappreciated, particularly in the investment community. So I think the challenge would potentially be, okay, how do we structure this in a way that positions us well to raise money?
Right.
Couple issues there. Probably one of the biggest is that we already have an investor. And one of the things we face when looking at getting additional capital into Outact is we're not really, the company wasn't at the stage where you would do a traditional B round. We are still sort of in A round territory, but we still had an A series investor.
Right.
And so investors would get interested in potentially the opportunity. What we could do, take a look at the cap table and say, this isn't going to work. So there's a possibility we're going to face the same kind of issue if we go out. Now, I think a lot of this depends on the deal we put together.
Yeah.
If we have good, solid publisher relationship, if we have a really big IP, if we have some of the elements that make financial sense from the investment perspective, I think that could open some doors for us. So that's one side of the piece, and the other is then just the logistical matter of how would we actually combine the companies. And
Yep.
I think that's less of an issue. Spend enough money on lawyers and they can solve anything.
Yeah, but I mean, Paul, I agree with you in the sense that, like, if we just talk about the fundamentals in terms of what we have and what we're bringing together, I do believe it is so valuable, like being able to have a team that's worked together that
Yeah.
has that lower cost structure because of China, and where we're bringing in like various types of expertise that are highly complementary in terms of like, game design from Paul Layden, product management, sort of publishing, experience on my side, and just like, the deep technical expertise that you guys have, especially from a, server backend networking perspective. So, I hope that if we find an investor that has the right level of sophistication and that understands what the key things required are to make a successful company, that hopefully we'll be able to get somebody interested.
I would hope so as well, because I think there's a good value proposition there.
Okay.
I think they just have to be open-minded enough to see the value in doing that, as opposed to, oh, why don't you just start a new company and we'll fund that, and then you can build a new team. That's typically the way you would do this, right?
Yep.
And I think one of your strategies working very well is that we work together to get one of the game released before we actually seeking for investment. I think that will be actually a pretty strong first step. That will show the value as we combine as a team, and that will actually convince them for any of the concerns they have.
Okay. Yeah. So, did I recommend that, or who recommended that?
I saw you mention that.
I mean, we could. Like right now, I'm totally open.
Yeah. So if I misunderstood, that's my problem. But
I mean that. I think what I was talking about was more trying to come up with a product strategy where we work on a smaller game first.
Right.
I mean, we could do that ahead of like combining or whatever.
I think that's fine either way. The structure isn't very important to that. More important is how do we attract those investors. And like Paul mentioned, there are some kind of challenges with our current structure, and we can't easily give away that. I mean, because we have 2 live game running, and we have our shareholder we are responsible for. So and I think the quickest way to solve that is to work together on a smaller project, get that released under whatever structure. Like that's something we need to figure out, right? But then we will seek investment for that, and I think that probably will be pretty stable. Kind of everything is risky, but this is, in my opinion, is less risky and can be done relatively quickly, in my opinion.
Okay.
To speak to that, the whole idea of it being relatively quickly. So I've been working towards some ideas that I think will be useful for us for like the last 7, I think maybe 8 days now. And this is like extremely hard work. Like it's as if we have already begun in some cases. Now, the idea that I'm going to be presenting to you guys is kind of along the lines of something smaller, and it's just to get our wheels turning. I have a lot of things I could speak to it. It's basically an idle game. Joseph mentioned idle games, so I tried to become really professional in idle games. I did not hundreds, but lots of hours of research and a bunch of designs. So in some ways, like we're already started, and we talk about how it's kind of like an older team that's been working for a while, but in a lot of ways, we're also brand new in some ways, because we've all worked together in small ways and kind of under a different management. But I don't think we've ever come together as pure, first time team. And so in some ways, those little ideas I've already gotten started on, and I don't know if this is the call to really talk about them. But and I don't have my charger, so I'm not on my laptop, so I'm not able to share. But I'm working on a video today, and all of the stuff that we're working on is going to be out there, just like this video now. So not only will you guys be like super educated on some of these idle games, on all the smaller games, I think we're gonna be able to educate a lot of other people as well. So I don't know. I'm excited for the process that we're going towards. Full transparency, a lot of hard work, and a new team that's worked together before, but in a whole new way now.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely wanted to work with you guys, and I think we will going to work together. It's just a matter of what kind of best way to achieve that.
Yep.
And I think we should just brainstorm the best way of doing that.
Yeah.
And all these kind of executive meetings matters.
Right. And then shifting over to roles and responsibilities. So there's been some comments in terms of roles and responsibilities when we talked at E3, but like in terms of a combined entity. So I'll just lay out my ideal scenarios. If we were able to raise funding, kind of combine, from my perspective, we haven't talked about the specific roles, but one of the things that I would love to do is to sort of take on that, assuming we did combine CEO role, and then lead the sort of value culture processes, things like that. Just talking to Paul, I think we had discussed about Paul being like the lead game designer. I do believe in a system of AORs. I don't know if you guys, I mean, you did check out my values document before, right? Where the other thing we could do is for every major responsibility, be very specific in terms of who owns what calls. So, there's different sorts of decision-making type of models. So one would be like lead-driven, top-down. Another's like democratic. Another would just be like the system of AORs. But I personally like the AOR model because it usually like gets rid of a lot of like politics and stuff like that. But yeah, and in terms of that stuff, please, what do you guys think? And please feel free to be as direct as possible.
So I would say that's kind of how we operate, although our culture is very fluid. So we do operate in areas of responsibility where people take ownership of things, but they're not always clearly defined. They tend to shift depending on the needs of what it is we're doing, right? So whether it's working for Sega, we had a whole different structure of how decisions got made for us because it's a totally different kind of project when you're working for a customer versus various internal projects. There's generally teams working on those, and the people working on those have a lot of autonomy, but that shifts very fluidly. So I think conceptually, I don't know if you agree, Sean, that's kind of similar to how we are already structured, but maybe not quite as formally, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we are definitely using area of responsibility, although we never reinforce that, so it's a little bit ad hoc. I would love to clarify that with the new entity or whatever the new team that we named that. That I think that will help a lot.
Okay. Yeah, and to be honest, when we had that. When we did the video interview last week with you, Sean, I mean, I was very encouraged by just how open all the discussion is, right? And we're all adults, and I think being able to for me, it's very encouraging to be able to talk about these things very directly. So I thought that was awesome. But
yeah, one of the great things about a really small company is there's less need for structure, and that allows us to just collaborate and get things done, right? I mean, it's why I love working in organizations like this. It's not to say larger organizations are bad, but there's one of the key advantages we have is that there don't have to be a lot of layers in decision making, and people can just get on a Skype call and figure stuff out when necessary. I think it's really a great way to work.
Okay. So in terms of I'm just trying to just thinking out loud, trying to figure out what's the best way to kind of start. So kind of the way that I was thinking is if we're going to be going out to investors to have a very specific strategy, meaning I guess it really depends on what we want to do, right? So if we start with a game, but we don't combine, then we'd have to figure out how to get that financed.
Right.
I did talk to a couple of folks during E3, and it seems like there might be some projects that we could potentially pick up just as publisher projects. But I'm not sure how they would feel if they were, we could just find out and just say, hey, we want to kind of work together. Or we can just say the other approach would be to come up with a 2 to 3 game 2 to 3 game strategy and try to raise money against that design against a combined entity. But I don't know if Shang and Paul C, if you guys have any specific opinions on how to have a preferred approach in terms of that.
Well, I think it depends a little on what the projects are. Yeah, it does get a little sticky. So even if we collaborated on a small project internally, the question is, how would something like that be structured?
Right.
There's a couple of ways. The most expedient way to do it would be to have Outact do it. But then you get into issues where, well, you can't really sell that to an investor because Outact owns the IP. So probably the better way to structure something like that is to actually form the new entity, do it under the auspices of that new entity. Outact could potentially contract and do the work and defer payment, or there's various ways we can work out that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the IP is vested in the new entity. I think that positions it better for investment. And then that leaves open a lot of potential deals once we do raise money, a lot of potential deal structures in how to bring Outact into the fold. I mean, if necessary, you could stay a work for hire relationship in a way, or the companies could be combined. A lot of that's going to depend on the potential investor and what their view is. So, so I think it may potentially work to we'll go out and form the new entity. Sean and I would stay at Outact. We would collaborate on these new ventures. I think it gets a little problematic if we leave Outact. We have fiduciary responsibility to maintain.
Okay.
I think this is fine. What we're trying to do here is create a situation that is beneficial to Outact shareholders, right? And we have to be sensitive to that as principals of Outact. So it would be very problematic for us to go into this new venture and still be responsible for Outact. So my first take would be, if we structure the new entity, you guys are in the new entity, we stay in Outact, we collaborate on this project. In some ways, the specifics of that collaboration depend on the project and how it's funded. And then we use that as a vehicle to look for investment money.
Okay.
And I think, Paul, we should be able to work with the new entity, right? Even we stay in Outact. Is there any thing prevent us from doing that?
It gets a little sticky. I mean, it's not okay for us to be spending significant amounts of our time working for what could be a potential competitor, another game developer, right? Because
what if we get approval from our investor?
If we get approval from FundPlus, then we're good, right? It's because really, well, as long as you and I approve, but no problem with that.
Which I think shouldn't be too hard. I don't want to abduct them in this kind of meeting, but I think that's something that we can. I think rather than going through a very complicated process, I think the first step is we start talking to Ita and Andy. And I think that they should be reasonable enough to allow us to do something. I mean, if we just to say we only going to work with Joseph and
right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think we can make a pretty good case to them that what we're trying to do here is create a potential value opportunity for Outact, and so this is good for both parties.
Absolutely.
So I think you're right. They would probably be happy to support that.
Yeah, and in that case, I think it'll be easier for Joseph and Paul to go and pitch for the new project, because we will be technically on board with the new entity.
Right.
As a contractor with the new entity. I think that would be easier. I mean, for us to go out and pitch, because I actually treat ourselves as part of the new entity already.
Right. Yes, that would be a huge benefit, is we could be officially listed as members of the new organization. And without that, the investor is going to be like, well, who are these guys? They don't really seem committed. They're not part of the company. So that is much preferable. So that's a good idea.
Yeah. Because the reason I mentioned this is that, the investors could be very concerned if the team member is, for example, like you said, not fully committed, it's part-time or things like that. I remember when I was raising funds for Outact, and some of our folks are part-time, and that was an immediate red flag for those investors.
Right.
Only until I have them have some like formal written like letters telling us like if the company got founded, I can convert it to full-time, then those investors will be less concerned. I mean, I think they still have concerns, but that would be better. So I think there should be some way to protect the interest of the new entity that will not cause those investors to have any concerns of their money. Like ultimately, their money goes into either investors or publishers. Their money goes into the new entity. They will want the new product to be completed with the right resource and within the right time. So I think there needs to be some kind of commitment, and I think that we need to fight very hard for that. Even that it's going to be challenging for us to immediately leave Outact, or for the rest of the team to immediately leave out and join the new entity. But I think there needs to be a way to, because I think the next step is to really talk to FunPlus, see what the best way they can accept.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and we need to figure out a way to brainstorm eventually how we would combine the companies. I think that's going to be another key point for investors.
Right.
That's going to come up immediately in the pitch. And we don't necessarily have to have the final answer, but I think we have to have some good proposals.
Okay.
And because every investor is going to have their own take and their own idea of how much something like this is a red flag. But the first question is going to be, well, okay, well, how are you going to put this together? Let's say I invest in this company. What's the structure going to look like? And we need to have a pretty decent answer for that, I think.
Yep. Yeah. So it's definitely a lot more complicated than a starting from scratch, more clean situation. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of value there. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you start clean, you don't have a 30-man team, right? So.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, when something is hard, it's usually worth doing, and that's
right.
what I felt. That's what I felt like on our last project that we were working on, Chong and Paul at Outact. I was trying to tell that particular company, like, look, I know this is hard, but that's why it's good, right? Like that's why we need to keep going. And we were only like 6 months away from launching that particular product. But to speak on product, because I'm loving what we're talking about, entities, and I'm letting you guys I'm hearing it all, and I think it all sounds really good. And a couple of times we mentioned product, and usually when I work on products, I measure it against the entity. So for example, I wouldn't have worked on, let's just call it Dang, the game Dang, with Outact unless the company that I was working with would approve it or not, right? Like I would probably pitch something bigger and stronger depending on the budget and the team and the executive team who approve the games. So recently when I'm working on these smaller games, I started to think like, well, these types of art styles are a little strong. I'm curious about these engineering techniques that I'm going to be needing for this game. I'm kind of wondering how Paul or Chris Duguay would execute these certain things. I can't say if this is too big or too small. So from a product standpoint, as I'm designing towards our clarity and direction, which it's not going to be, of course, it'll never be this whole 100% Paul Layden's pet peeve game. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I'm trying to take us really fast to clarity and direction. But where I was wondering recently, this last week, is it's hard for me to gauge what it is that I should build and what's too big and too small without knowing, without talking about you guys with the specific product and getting feedback on engineering, without knowing time and budget and stuff like that, right? So if we move towards an investor and we want to have these ideas, I don't know, one thing I think of is like small, medium, large, small idea, medium game, large game. I know we want to talk small, but I feel that I don't know with the speed in which Joseph and you guys and us, we could pull together funding. but I'm trying to stay ahead of that so we can actually have clarity on ideas. And I've kind of wished I was around Paul and Chris the last couple of days as I was designing, because I wanted to be like, hey, is this idea actually too much? Because I know we want a small game, and I can dial it back, but I also don't know the trust and faith behind the investment team, and maybe they're willing to allow us to take some of those risks. So from the product standpoint, I'm just kind of playing it in a middle ground, nothing too extreme and nothing too safe, and waiting to get into a room with Outact and say, here's the feature list. What do we think? You know, what about this? Do you guys hate it? Do you love it? Is it art? Is the art complicated? Do you think it could get featured? Is it something we want to spend 6-7 months on? Will it take a year? You know, those kind of details. So I'm hoping that in the next week or so, that it's just something I've been wanting to do, just because I'm on fire and I want to keep throwing logs on it. Like I was hoping to meet with Paul and Chris and Chong and talk about games, and of course Joseph, and see if some of these things are too big and just keep it moving, because I have finished one of the ideas that Joseph and I had wanted to do. And if we wanted to move towards a different idle game or a battle-based game or some AFK arena type game, then I need to move immediately. So I'm hoping we can start talking about those kind of estimates and measurements and tech stuff as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I'm kind of sharing my screen again, but some of the initial, like from my perspective, in terms of like what are key opportunities right now, it does seem like there are opportunities in terms of idle games, in the sense that there's a lot of idle games out there and a lot of people are going after it. But I think that there are some innovations as well as recent features in the idle category that I think would allow us to be kind of successful there. There's also been a big push in terms of auto chess, and a lot of those games are coming out right now. I would say at this point, we should probably wait, because there's like this whole wave of auto chess games coming out, kind of see where the market is, and then come in like really late, like last mover advantage, see what they all do, and see, you know, and then do like a second generation against that first wave.
That's right. I was trying to say, even we want to do auto chess, that shouldn't be looking similar to what existing in the market, because
it's got to be different. But we could take the lessons from this next wave that's coming and then try to advance it. You know, there's also a lot of people are talking about Archero, where you know those guys are doing like 400K just in IAP every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a lot of people looking at AFK Arena, but given our backgrounds and given like what we've done in the past, I think if we can significantly advance the AFK Arena, then that might be another potential area. But I think as an initial step, if we were like the easiest of those is idle. So that's kind of that I think as like a first game, doing an idle game with some of the innovations that we're thinking of, I think would probably be like a first initial game. But then, we should probably we don't have to go into the details of the specific game design, but coming up with a high level 2 to 3 game strategy.
Yeah.
Would make sense. And then if game 3 is like an IP based game, just given my relationships with various IP holders, and that might be interesting as well.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm typically, one of my philosophy is like, I need to come out at least 1 or 2 conclusion from a meeting like that. There shouldn't be a meeting that we meet and there is no conclusion, there is no resolution. So I think for this meeting is a few things I think we can pretty much finalize. One is the responsibility that I totally agree with you, Joseph. I think you need to be the CEO of the new entity, and you will be going for overall strategy and general BD and high level project management, and Paulie then should be the designer, and Paul Chifo and I will be managing the team and for day-to-day kind of business. And that one of the a role that we haven't discussed about Paul Chifo is his strong background in financial and legal. So and he can be really a great value to review all the, for example, contracts or any kind of the high-level review of the business strategies. You can already tell from what he mentioned at the very beginning of this meeting. I think these are all the great responsibilities that we can quite easily just decide how to divide. And the second thing, I think, no matter what the new entity will look like, what's the structure, I think we should start working together. I mean, we will have team that available to do some quick prototype, and I'm totally cool that start talking to Paul Layden about the new design, and we will decide what to work next, and I can assign a small team to start doing prototype, and we don't waste any time up there. I mean, I think before we actually finalize how do we work together, I think that should be something that we can do. I mean, since you guys are kind of committing your time, I think it's totally fair for us to commit in time. As for this, I think one thing we need to quickly resolve is the ownership of even just the prototype, right? Because that needs to be finalized. Like who owns that? I mean, technically it should be the new entity, but that needs to be something Fund Plus needs to be agreeing on. So that's what I'm going to reach out to Itao next. I think he was in Beijing, and I think I was planning to talk to him once he get back. So I'll reach out to him. I'll actually raise this to him, and hopefully to get a approval from Fund Plus for anything we do with the new entity. And that's my next step. So that's something I think we pretty much all agreed on.
Okay.
In my opinion, is kind of the resolution of this first meeting.
One thing I could do is I could actually, just set up a few initial feelers with investors to just kind of see how they kind of perceive how we're approaching stuff, and then maybe just put an initial sort of pitch together just to get early feedback, kind of friendlier folks who will be okay with seeing us in kind of like a not so finalized state. But
yeah. Right. That sounds good. We definitely would need approvals from Fund Plus before doing that, though. Okay. One thing you never want that to boomerang back, because somebody saw something in a presentation and gets back to them. Much better to do that directly up front. But that sounds like a great idea. Getting some feedback, that could be really, really helpful.
So I'll reach out Ita right after this call.
Okay.
Cool.
When I'll meet with him. Hopefully that'll happen sooner.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think it's implicit in this that we have to actually form an actual corporate entity, or we can't really do any of this. If there's no new entity, it can't own the work product, the prototype, right? So as a basic, we have to have at least a shell entity there to own it. And getting those sort of fundamentals right actually makes things a lot easier going forward. Like I said, anything's fixable by lawyers, but it's very expensive if you have to do remedial work. Right. So that would be good. It doesn't have to be much, but we need to get a corporate entity set up, get basic articles of incorporation and bylaws, a basic cap sheet, and then we're basically good to go. We need a name, a logo. That usually takes man years to figure out.
Joseph, I just wanted to steal your game maker logo for the.
I think that's company name and logo right there, man.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think Joseph would make a good CEO because he's kind of confusing and hard to work with. So he's already got all the key strengths right there. I'm just messing with you.
Paul, Steve, do you have any recommendations in terms of a entity, whether it's like a California C Corp or I think the cost would be higher if we tried to go for like Delaware, but just an LLC?
Not really. Typically, Delaware is very cheap.
Okay.
So if you want to raise equity, it's got to be a C Corp, and it's most likely needs to be a Delaware C Corp. That doesn't really matter, though. We'll probably reincorporate the company anyway.
Okay.
And so it's very easy to reincorporate the company, as Delaware. But there can be complications. We had a lot of complications on in Outact because of the international nature of it. Typically, those kind of companies are structured as offshore holding companies because you can't really have a single entity in China and the U.S. For us, it was complicated because we already had IP and value in the original LLC in the U.S. that Shang started, and it was right about that time a lot of companies were offshoring headquarters in order for tax savings. So there were a lot of new restrictions put in place in terms of transferring IP to an offshore entity.
So what's the current structure for you guys? Are you guys Cayman or like what?
No, we're actually, so we had to be a U.S. based company because of that. So we're a U.S. based company. Outact is a U.S. based company. Okay. The China team is a completely separate company. Actually, it's owned by Shang. And we have essentially a VIE relationship, a variable interest entity. It's basically a contractual level relationship between the two companies where they essentially work on contract to us. All of the IP and benefit of the work product accrues to Outact. So it's sort of like an offshore relationship, except the offshore entity is onshore.
Is the China team still the same crew?
Yeah, they're the same.
Same people, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So anyway, I don't think that would necessarily apply to us, although it does maybe complicate the formation. But it's an example of how once you invest an IP and value in a certain place, it does get more complicated to move it around. So generally, you want to take your best shot. I think if we do it set up in Delaware as a C corp, that's pretty safe. And certainly with regards to Outact, initially, I think it would be a contractual relationship with Outact, so that's no problem. Eventually, when we combine, it does become, that's where it gets complicated because we're a multinational entity.
Right.
And that we'd have to really rely on the lawyers to figure out, okay, what are our options here? And that's probably a conversation we should have pretty early on, because I think it affects what kind of deal terms we could propose to a potential investor as to how we would combine the companies. So, and then, theoretically, the China company is a separate entity. It could just contract to the new company, but then we potentially get into some pretty thorny fiduciary issues with Outact because, the intent of that relationship was to form a unified company. Okay. So it gets complicated, in other words.
I think ultimately that FunPlus needs to approve that. As long as FunPlus approves everything, that we should be all set.
Okay.
Ideal scenario is FunPlus invest into the new entity, then problem all solved.
Then it's very simple. Yeah, that would be perfectly fine.
So Sean probably should be a best bet to seek for investment. But either way, I think FunPlus is very reasonable investors.
Yeah.
They are, yes.
I think if we get a very good value proposition to Outact, basically to give them return, I think that they will be totally happy to do whatever needed for the new entity.
Yep, I think that's true. And I hope they continue to be supportive. They have been really fantastic. So one thing is we are going to need some legal help. I don't know, Joseph, if you have contacts with lawyers. We work with Fenwick, who are fantastic, but stratospherically expensive as well. They're sort of incredibly expensive and worth every penny. Okay. So we could certainly go with them, but it would not be cheap. A smaller firm may be more reasonable for a company in our state. So if you have any contacts there and would like to go that way, that's fine too. But in one way or another, we probably need a little bit of legal help to get this thing started.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. So yeah, I wrote down like the sort of next steps and things like that. Seems like a lot of this is going to hinge on the discussion that Shang has with FunPlus, but assuming that's all good to go, then I can take the next steps in terms of forming some type of entity and trying to find some legal help, and hopefully away we go.
Yeah, totally.
Excellent.
So yeah, after I talk to FunPlus, I'll propose a meeting between Joseph, you, and myself, and the whoever from FunPlus. And we'll talk about the plan. If they agree with the new plan, I think we need to sit down. together. I think they won't be just saying, "Oh, go ahead," and we'll approve everything. They need to understand what we are doing together. So I think then I'll propose a meeting. Does that work for you?
Sounds good.
Okay, cool.
All right, great. Well, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Nice talking to you. I mean, it's been a
That's
while.
really nice seeing you guys.
Totally happy.
Yeah, good to see you guys and talk to you again.
Yeah, bye guys. Have a nice
Take care
day.
now.
Bye, everyone.